subscribe to my channel. Thank you.
Welcome to our AWS Lambda interview questions and answers session. This is the part 2. What are the advantages of using AWS Lambda over traditional server-based solutions for application development? Answer: the advantages of using AWS Lambda include serverless. You don't have to manage servers or infrastructure. Automatic scaling. AWS Lambda handles scaling based on demand. Pay-per-use pricing. You only pay for the compute time you consume. Event-driven. Lambda functions can respond to various events across AWS services. Reduced operational overhead. AWS manages patching, monitoring, and security. Can you limit the maximum number of concurrent executions for an AWS Lambda function? Answer: yes, you can limit the maximum number of concurrent executions for a Lambda function using the reserved concurrency configuration. This allows you to control the concurrency to prevent overloading downstream resources. Hello, dear viewers! We're excited to offer you a valuable resource, a PDF version of our exclusive questionnaire. Inbox Stray, simply drop a comment below expressing your interest and subscribe to this channel. We'll send you a direct message with the download link. What is the AWS Lambda execution context, and how does it impact the initialization time of a function? Answer: the execution context is a temporary environment created when a Lambda function is invoked. It includes the runtime, memory, and any external connections. The initialization time refers to the setup required for the execution context, and it impacts the cold start time for a function. How can you ensure that AWS Lambda functions have access to the required AWS SDKs and APIs to interact with other AWS services? Answer: AWS Lambda functions have access to the AWS SDKs and APIs by default. You can use the AWS SDK for your chosen runtime to interact with AWS services, and the required credentials are automatically available through the execution environment's IAM role. Can AWS Lambda functions be used for long-term storage or archival of data, such as log files or backup files? Answer: AWS Lambda functions are not designed for long-term storage. You should use services like Amazon S3, Amazon Glacier, or AWS RDS for long-term data storage and archival. Lambda functions are better suited for data processing and event-driven tasks. What is AWS Lambda's default retry behavior for failed function invocations? Answer: AWS Lambda has built-in retry behavior for asynchronous invocations. If a function execution fails, AWS Lambda will automatically retry the invocation twice, with delays between retries. You can configure additional retry behavior if needed. How can you secure the environment variables used in AWS Lambda functions to store sensitive data? Answer: to secure environment variables with sensitive data in AWS Lambda functions, use AWS Identity and Access Management (IAM) policies to control access. Store sensitive information in AWS Secrets Manager or AWS Systems Manager Parameter Store. Avoid hard-coding sensitive data directly in your function code. Can AWS Lambda functions access resources within a virtual private cloud, VPC, and what are the considerations for doing so? Answer: AWS Lambda functions can access resources within a virtual private cloud, VPC, by configuring a VPC for the function. Considerations include setting up the correct security groups, subnets, and ensuring that the function has an appropriate IAM role to access VPC resources. What is the maximum deployment package size for AWS Lambda functions, and how can you work with larger packages? Answer: the maximum deployment package size for AWS Lambda functions is 250 megabytes uncompressed. To work with larger packages, you can use Amazon S3 to store your code and dependencies and reference them in your function configuration. Can you share code and resources between AWS Lambda functions? If so, how? Answer: yes, you can share code and resources between Lambda functions using AWS Lambda layers. You create a layer containing common code and libraries, which can be attached to multiple functions, allowing you to share resources and reduce duplication. What is the maximum execution timeout for an AWS Lambda function, and how can you ensure that your function does not get terminated due to this limit? Answer: the maximum execution timeout for an AWS Lambda function is 15 minutes. To avoid termination due to this limit, you can split long-running tasks into smaller units, use AWS step functions to coordinate them, or consider alternative AWS services designed for longer execution times. Can AWS Lambda functions be used to process and transform data in real time from Amazon Kinesis data streams? Answer: yes. AWS Lambda functions can be used to process and transform data in real time from Amazon Kinesis data streams. You can configure Lambda to read events from Kinesis streams and process them as they arrive. What is the maximum number of event sources that can be associated with an AWS Lambda function, and how does it impact function performance? Answer: AWS Lambda allows you to associate multiple event sources with a single function, but the exact limit may vary by region and service. However, it's essential to consider the concurrency and scaling behavior when associating multiple event sources, as it can impact function performance. Can you implement custom error handling in AWS Lambda functions, and what are the best practices for doing so? Answer: yes, you can implement custom error handling in AWS Lambda functions by adding try-catch blocks or error handling code in your function. Best practices for error handling include logging errors, emitting error events for monitoring, and using dead letter queues (DLQs) to capture and handle failed events. How can you ensure that AWS Lambda functions running in a VPC can access the public internet when necessary? Answer: to allow AWS Lambda functions in a VPC to access the public internet, you can configure a network address translation (NT) gateway in the VPC. This allows outbound internet traffic from the Lambda functions while maintaining security. What is the AWS Lambda Power Tuning Tool, and how can it help optimize Lambda function performance? Answer: the AWS Lambda Power Tuning Tool is an open-source tool that helps optimize the memory allocation (power) of Lambda functions for cost and performance. It analyzes historical data to suggest the optimal memory setting for your functions. Can you share AWS Lambda layers between AWS accounts, and how can you achieve this? Answer: yes, you can share Lambda layers between AWS accounts. You do this by creating a Lambda layer in one account and then making it public or sharing it with specific AWS accounts using resource policies. The receiving account can then use the shared layer in their Lambda functions. How can you set up alerting and notifications for AWS Lambda functions to monitor performance and errors? Answer: you can set up alerting and notifications for AWS Lambda functions using Amazon CloudWatch alarms. Create alarms based on specific metrics, like error rates or duration, and configure actions like sending notifications to Amazon SNS topics or triggering AWS Lambda functions. What is the AWS Lambda Data API, and how can it be used to interact with AWS Lambda functions? Answer: the AWS Lambda Data API is an HTTP API that allows you to interact with AWS Lambda functions over HTTPS. It enables you to call Lambda functions directly using standard HTTP requests, making it useful for integrating with various applications and services. Can you specify a specific runtime for your AWS Lambda functions, or are you limited to the supported runtimes provided by AWS? Answer: AWS Lambda provides a set of supported runtimes, and you are limited to choosing from these runtimes. You cannot specify a custom runtime. You can, however, create custom runtimes using the AWS Lambda Runtime API, but they must be compatible with the execution environment. How does AWS Lambda handle versioning and aliases, and what are some use cases for these features? Answer: AWS Lambda provides versioning and aliases for managing function deployments. Versions are immutable snapshots of your code, while aliases are pointers to specific versions. Common use cases include safely rolling out new versions of your functions, creating blue-green deployments, and A/B testing. Can you run AWS Lambda functions inside a virtual private cloud, VPC, and what are the benefits of doing so? Answer: yes, you can run AWS Lambda functions inside a VPC. Benefits include enhanced security and control over network traffic, the ability to access resources in your VPC, and more advanced configurations for managing Lambda function connectivity. What is the maximum number of environment variables you can set for an AWS Lambda function, and what are some best practices for using them? Answer: you can set up to 64 kilobytes of environment variables for an AWS Lambda function. Best practices include using environment variables to store configuration data and sensitive information, rather than hard-coding values directly in your function code. Can you configure custom domains and SSL certificates for AWS Lambda functions, and what service can you use for this purpose? Answer: you can configure custom domains and SSL certificates for AWS Lambda functions using Amazon API Gateway. This service allows you to create APIs, set up custom domains, and enable HTTPS for your serverless application. What is warm-up in the context of AWS Lambda, and how can it be achieved to reduce cold start times? Answer: warm-up is a technique to reduce cold start times by pre-warming Lambda functions. You can implement it by creating a scheduled CloudWatch event that invokes a function periodically, keeping it warm and ready to handle incoming requests. Can you use custom runtimes for AWS Lambda functions, and what is the benefit of doing so? Answer: yes, you can use custom runtimes for AWS Lambda functions. This allows you to run code in languages not officially supported by AWS Lambda. It grants flexibility but also requires additional effort in building and maintaining the runtime. What are the AWS well-architected framework's best practices for designing serverless applications with AWS Lambda? Answer: the AWS well-architected framework recommends following best practices such as implementing fine-grained authorization and access control, monitoring and optimizing costs, implementing error handling and retries, designing for scalability and resiliency, leveraging AWS managed services where possible. How does AWS Lambda handle resource cleanup and cleanup tasks when a function execution is completed or terminated? Answer: AWS Lambda automatically takes care of cleaning up resources and terminating the execution environment when a function execution is completed or terminated. This includes closing any open connections or cleaning up temporary files. Can you set up custom IAM roles for AWS Lambda functions, and what permissions can you grant to these roles? Answer: yes, you can set up custom IAM roles for AWS Lambda functions. You can grant permissions to access specific AWS resources and services, such as S3 buckets, DynamoDB tables, or other AWS services. These roles allow you to define and control what your functions can do. What is the AWS Lambda Shared VPC feature, and what are the advantages of using it for networking in your serverless applications? Answer: AWS Lambda Shared VPC allows you to reuse existing virtual private clouds, VPCs, to run your functions. The advantages include simplified network management, access to resources in a central VPC, and the ability to reuse existing network configurations. How does AWS Lambda handle concurrent executions of the same function, and what mechanisms can you use to control concurrency? Answer: AWS Lambda handles concurrent executions by creating separate execution environments for each function invocation. You can control concurrency using the reserved concurrency setting to limit the number of concurrent executions for a function. What is the AWS Serverless Application Repository, and how can it benefit developers working with AWS Lambda? Answer: the AWS Serverless Application Repository is a service that allows developers to discover, deploy, and share serverless applications and resources. It benefits developers by providing pre-built serverless applications, reducing development time, and encouraging code sharing and collaboration. Can AWS Lambda functions be triggered by custom events or data sources outside of the AWS ecosystem? Answer: yes. AWS Lambda functions can be triggered by custom events or data sources outside of the AWS ecosystem. You can use custom integrations or webhooks via Amazon API Gateway, create HTTP endpoints, or use services like AWS Step Functions to orchestrate custom events. What is the AWS Lambda Function Warmer, and how can it be used to reduce cold start times? Answer: the AWS Lambda Function Warmer is a tool or script that can be used to keep Lambda functions warm by periodically invoking them. This helps reduce cold start times and ensures that functions are responsive when needed. How can you ensure that AWS Lambda functions have access to the latest security patches and updates for their execution environment? Answer: AWS Lambda manages the underlying execution environment and ensures it is up to date with the latest security patches and updates. Developers do not need to worry about this aspect, as AWS takes care of the maintenance. What is the AWS Lambda Power Bump feature, and how can it be used to optimize function performance? Answer: the AWS Lambda Power Bump feature is an option to incrementally increase memory allocation and CPU power for Lambda functions. It can be used to fine-tune function performance and optimize cost-effectiveness. Can AWS Lambda functions access resources in other AWS accounts, and what are the considerations when setting up cross-account access? Answer: yes. AWS Lambda functions can access resources in other AWS accounts, but you must set up cross-account access using IAM roles and policies. Considerations include configuring trust relationships between accounts and specifying resource permissions. How does AWS Lambda pricing work for functions that are not actively processing events or requests? AWS Lambda pricing is based on the number of requests and the duration of function execution. If a function is not actively processing events or requests, you are not billed for execution time, but you may still incur charges for the number of requests. Can AWS Lambda functions be used to process data from external message brokers, such as Apache Kafka or RabbitMQ? Yes. AWS Lambda functions can process data from external message brokers like Apache Kafka or RabbitMQ using custom integrations or middlewares to bridge the message broker with Lambda. The Lambda function can then process the messages as they arrive. What is the AWS Lambda at Edge service, and how can it be used to enhance the performance and security of web applications? AWS Lambda at Edge is a service that allows you to run Lambda functions at the edge locations of Amazon CloudFront, AWS Content Delivery Network. It is used to enhance the performance and security of web applications by allowing you to customize and optimize content delivery and security at the edge. What is the benefit of using Amazon CloudWatch Logs Insights with AWS Lambda functions, and how can it help in troubleshooting issues? Amazon CloudWatch Logs Insights is a tool that allows you to search and analyze logs from AWS Lambda functions. It benefits troubleshooting by providing a powerful query language to quickly identify and diagnose issues in Lambda function executions. Can AWS Lambda functions be used for running long-lived background processes or daemons that run indefinitely? AWS Lambda functions are designed for event-driven, short-duration tasks. They cannot run indefinitely as daemons. If you require long-lived background processes, consider using services like Amazon EC2, AWS Fargate, or AWS Elastic Beanstalk. What is the maximum allowable deployment package size for AWS Lambda functions in the AWS Management Console, and how can you work with larger packages? In the AWS Management Console, the maximum allowable deployment package size for AWS Lambda functions is 3 megabytes. To work with larger packages, you can use the AWS CLI or SDKs to create and update functions, allowing larger deployment packages of up to 50 megabytes. How can you integrate AWS Lambda functions with AWS step functions, and what benefits does this integration offer for complex workflows? AWS Lambda functions can be integrated with AWS step functions to build and orchestrate complex workflows. This integration allows for coordination of multiple Lambda functions and other AWS services in a structured manner, with benefits like error handling, retries, and conditional branching. What is the maximum number of concurrent executions a single AWS Lambda function can support, and how can you ensure that you don't exceed this limit? The maximum number of concurrent executions a single AWS Lambda function can support is determined by its concurrency limit, which can vary depending on your account and region. You can set a concurrency limit or use the reserved concurrency feature to control the number of concurrent executions and prevent exceeding the limit. How can you monitor and analyze the execution duration and performance of AWS Lambda functions, especially when they are part of a larger application stack? You can monitor and analyze the execution duration and performance of AWS Lambda functions by using AWS CloudWatch to collect and visualize metrics, setting up alarms to receive notifications, enabling AWS X-Ray for tracing and detailed analysis, and using distributed tracing to understand function behavior within the larger application stack. Can you execute AWS Lambda functions in response to events generated by custom applications or devices? If so, how do you achieve this integration? Yes, you can execute AWS Lambda functions in response to events generated by custom applications or devices. Integration can be achieved through custom event sources or by using Amazon API Gateway to create HTTP endpoints that trigger Lambda functions. Alternatively, you can use AWS IT Core for IT device integration. What is the AWS Lambda Extensions feature, and how can it enhance the monitoring and security of Lambda functions? AWS Lambda Extensions is a feature that allows you to install and run extensions alongside your Lambda functions. Extensions can enhance monitoring and security by providing additional visibility into function execution, enabling security agents, and collecting metrics for analysis. Can AWS Lambda functions be triggered by custom metrics or logs from your application? If so, how is this integration typically implemented? Answer: AWS Lambda functions can be triggered by custom metrics or logs from your application using Amazon CloudWatch alarms. You can create custom alarms based on application-specific metrics and configure actions to trigger Lambda functions when alarm conditions are met.
Hey, if you like the content, please subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a bite of Azure brilliance.